Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into the paradox of power, and we're doing it through the totally wild life of Marcus Furius Camillus. Now, this is a guy who wasn't just handed greatness, He built it from the ground up. He went from a respectable but pretty modest family to becoming the ultimate Roman hero. We are talking about a man who literally saved his entire civilization from the ashes. But here's the thing. His story is so much more than just swords and shields. It is this incredibly profound look at leadership, morality, and the really heavy price you sometimes pay for sticking to your principles. Let's get right into it. 5. That is just a staggering number when you're talking about the ancient world. Throughout his really long life, which spanned most of the 4th century BC, by the way, Camillus was appointed to the absolute highest emergency office in Rome 5 separate times. And he triumphed 4 times. But here's what's really strange. He never once served as a standard consul. You see, the political climate in Rome back then was incredibly tense. The everyday people and the Senate were basically constantly at each other's throats. Because of all that friction, the standard consulship was actually suspended a lot. But whenever the city faced absolute, existential disaster, who did they call? They called Camillus. Now, to really understand his role, we've got to completely strip away all of our modern baggage with the word dictator. Today, sure, it immediately implies tyranny, but in the early Roman Republic, it was actually a sacred, deeply constitutional emergency measure. When things got incredibly dire, Rome would grant one single man exceptional, absolute authority to resolve a specific crisis. But, and this is a massive catch, there was a strict maximum term limit of 6 months. So a great man was entrusted with ultimate power on the strict, ironclad condition that he lay it down right on schedule. And honestly, more than any other early Roman, Camillus just perfectly embodied this ideal. 5 times they handed him absolute power, and 5 times the second the job was done, he walked away. So his very first major test with all this power happened at a place called Veii. This was a massive, extremely wealthy Etruscan city just 12 miles north of Rome, and these two powers had been going at it for generations. The decisive siege kicks off in 405 BC, and it quickly turns into this exhausting 10-year grind. It was literally the longest war Rome had ever fought. For the first time ever, soldiers couldn't even go home for the season. They were forced to winter out in the field. It was a brutal, miserable stalemate. But finally, in 396 BC, Camillus takes command. And how does he break a decade-long deadlock? He brilliantly digs a mining tunnel right beneath the enemy walls and captures the entire city from the inside out. Now, you'd probably expect the guy to throw a massive parade and celebrate, right? Instead, as Camillus looked down from this high tower watching his soldiers pillage the almost infinite riches of this defeated city, he actually shocked everyone. He wept. He was hit with this intense, overwhelming religious self-doubt. He immediately prayed to the gods, begging that if any sort of cosmic punishment was coming down the pike for this massive display of Roman hubris, it should fall solely on him. He wanted his people totally spared. And literally right after uttering that prayer, as he turned to leave, he tripped and fell hard. For Camillus, that purposeful stumble was actually a huge relief. The greatest general of his era genuinely considered tripping over his own 2 feet to be a lucky break. Basically, he saw it as payment accepted by the gods to spare Rome. Fast forward to his very next military campaign, a siege at a neighboring city called Furii. And here we get one of the most cinematic moments of his entire life. A local schoolmaster inside Furii saw an opportunity for a massive, massive payoff. Day by day, this guy leads the noble children of the city out for their daily exercise, and day by day, he inches them closer and closer to the Roman lines, until finally, he totally betrays them. He delivers the kids straight into the Roman camp, right to Camillus. But Camillus was completely astounded by this treachery. Instead of using these kids as hostages to force a quick, easy surrender, he took a totally different route. He stripped the schoolmaster, tied his hands tightly behind his back, handed the children a bunch of rods, and literally let the boys whip their treacherous master every single step of the way back to their own city gates. That incredible, crazy moment gives us this absolutely defining quote. Camillus turns to his men and says, "A great general should rely on his own virtue and not on other men's vices." He recognized that, yes, war is inherently violent and ugly, but he firmly insisted there were still rules. There was still a baseline of basic human decency. To him, a victory won through the abuse and betrayal of children wasn't a victory at all. And you know what? This strict, unbending moral code completely stunned the people of Furii. In fact, watching the Romans return their children unharmed, the Fulerians basically said, "We're done," and voluntarily surrendered. It's kind of absurd when you really think about it. An entire fortified city giving up just because some kids whipped their terrible teacher. But they openly declared that Rome hadn't just defeated them with pure strength, they had entirely outclassed them in virtue. But as you might guess, sticking that rigidly to your principles can very quickly make you public enemy number one. It is a timeless truth, really. Doing the right thing often makes you wildly unpopular. After all these massive successes, Camillus's strictness really started to turn the Roman people against him. First off, he had made a religious vow to give the god Apollo 1/10 of the massive spoils from Veii. So when the soldiers had already pocketed all the loot, he rigidly demanded they give a portion of it back. Obviously, they hated that. Second, he fiercely opposed this very popular political plan to physically pack up and relocate half of Rome's population to the newly emptied city of Veii. And finally, absolutely furious with his stubbornness, his political enemies hit him with trumped-up charges, actually accusing him of stealing Etruscan bronze gates. So rather than stick around to face a deeply unfair rigged trial, our ultimate Roman hero made a choice. He went into self-imposed exile. So picture this. As he's walking out of Rome, heading off to some small neighboring city, he stops right at the city gates, and he delivers this incredibly heavy, ominous prayer. He looked up and asked the gods that if he was truly being driven out through the sheer malice of the people without any real fault of his own, that the Romans might quickly repent of it. He prayed that all mankind might witness their need for the assistance and desire for the return of Camillus. I mean, wow, that is a seriously dramatic curse to drop on your ungrateful countrymen as you walk out the door. And what's genuinely terrifying? The universe answered him almost immediately. The Gauls came. This kicks off one of the absolute darkest chapters in all of early Roman history. It all started with a totally botched diplomatic mission where Roman ambassadors unlawfully fought against a migrating Gallic army. Well, the Gauls didn't take that lightly. They marched directly on Rome. The Roman army rushed out to meet them at the Allia River and was utterly, completely annihilated. Rome was suddenly left entirely defenseless, so the Gauls just marched right in, sacked the city, and burned it straight to the ground. Meanwhile, a tiny group of survivors managed to barricade themselves up on the Capitol Hill. And right then, in their absolute darkest, most terrifying, most desperate hour, those terrified survivors realized something horrible. They desperately needed the exact man they had just kicked out of the city. So they secretly sent word to Camillus, begging him to come back and save them. Now, before we see how this insane crisis gets resolved, it's really worth noting how our two brilliant ancient sources frame the whole disaster. Both Livy and Plutarch cover this Gallic sack, but they do it a bit differently. Livy really focuses on the national myth-making side of things. He treats this disaster as the ultimate fiery crucible that essentially forged the Roman identity. Plutarch, on the other hand, frames the whole thing as a profound moral test within the biography of a wise statesman. He zones in on Camillus's personal ethical decisions. But regardless of how they frame it, both of these historians completely converge on the incredible, highly dramatic climax of the story. So here's the scene. The Romans, barricaded up on the Capitol, are starving. They're completely desperate. They finally break down and agree to pay the Gauls a massive, humiliating ransom in gold just to get them to leave the ruined city. But as they're weighing the gold out, the Romans notice something's wrong. They start complaining that the Gauls are using rigged, overly heavy scales to cheat them out of even more treasure. And the Gallic chieftain, a guy named Brennus, responds with just legendary arrogance. He unclips his massive, heavy iron sword and slams it down onto the scales, adding its weight to the gold the Romans already owe. He looks right at them and sneers this famous, devastating phrase, "Vae victis," woe to the conquered. But literally, just as Brennus drops that sword, who shows up? Camillus. The exiled hero who has just been appointed dictator once more enters the smoldering ruins of Rome with a fresh relief army right behind him. He marches straight up to this ransom exchange, physically sweeps the scales right off the table, and delivers the line that would basically define him in Roman memory forever. He looks at them and says, "Romans recover their country with steel, not with gold." Talk about an entrance. He cancels the humiliating treaty right on the spot, initiates a violent, brutal clash right there in the ruins, and ultimately drives the Gauls entirely out of Rome. It is a totally triumphant, cinematic recovery of the city. But as it turns out, just recovering the city was only half the battle. Rome was still a smoking, devastated ruin. The citizens were traumatized, and honestly, they just wanted to abandon the ashes entirely and pack up and move to the empty city of Veii. But Camillus stepped up yet again. Through these incredibly passionate speeches defending the holy ground of Rome, the temples, and the sacred burial places of their ancestors, he successfully convinced the people to stay. Because of his legendary leadership in the war and his steady, guiding hand during the hasty, chaotic rebuilding of their home, Camillus earned the ultimate title, the second founder of Rome. He essentially became the new Romulus, and he served his people faithfully until the day he died in 365 BC. So what is the ultimate takeaway from all of this? Well, Plutarch often compares his subjects to find these deeper universal truths. And here he sets our scrupulous Roman model, Camillus, right up against the cunning Greek leader Themistocles. Now, both of these men were undeniably effective saviors of their respective cities, for sure. But their methods, they were complete polar opposites. As we've seen, Camillus was deeply moral, totally transparent, and literally willing to suffer exile rather than compromise his rigid principles. Themistocles, on the other hand, while he was absolutely brilliant, he was highly theatrical, very deceptive, and pretty obviously self-seeking in how he got things done. They represent two entirely different colliding philosophies of leadership. Which brings us to the ultimate question for you to ponder today. When the very survival of your nation is on the line, which kind of savior is actually greater? Is it better to win with absolute moral purity, proving that your civilization is genuinely virtuous even in its darkest, most desperate hour? Or is it better to be led by someone who is simply effective, using any theatrical or deceptive means necessary, just so long as the city survives? Camillus chose virtue. It cost him dearly at times, but it made him immortal. It's a profound paradox of power and definitely something to think about the next time you consider what truly makes a great leader. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you next time.